This is episode 180. I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and this is Conservation and Science Podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. And it is July. Actually, when I'm recording this episode, it's still June, but you're going to listen to that in July. And it is a holiday season, so everything is just a little bit different rhythm. So I decided to treat you for a change to another solo episode. And there's a good reason for that. Not only holiday season is the reason for a solo episode, but also I kind of want to use this platform, want to use my podcast to communicate with you and respond to some of your comments. And these were comments very interesting comments that were under the tweet. I sent a tweet some time ago. Actually, it was in May. And the tweet reads, "Hunters are not good or bad. They just are. Therefore, they must be managed just like and as a part of the wildlife they hunt." And I thought there was like a lot of good comments under this tweet. And why didn't I respond on Twitter? Because I think that social media, especially Twitter, are not a good place to have a conversation. And I have this platform, a podcast platform that a lot of you listen to. And I think this is an opportunity for me to express my thoughts and respond to your comments. And this is part of like a larger theme that I'm gradually moving away from social media. Of course, I'm not saying that I'm leaving social media, but I think that it is incredibly damaging. It is incredible hog of time and focus. And I think that overall, in general, we as a society will be slowly moving away from social media. The sooner, the better. And by the way, to stay in touch with me, the best way is to subscribe to my newsletter if you haven't already. So social media is all good and well, but like I said, probably some of the stuff is already not going onto my social media. It is always going into my newsletter. So link is in the description of the show, or just go to newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com and subscribe if you haven't already. So now let's go back to address that tweet, what I meant about it, and address some of the responses. Not really address responses, not in the sense like I'm going to answer some comments. It's more of like my thoughts, because I thought that some of the comments were quite good. And with that tweet, I was trying to encapsulate what I generally think about hunting and hunters and their place in the world and their place in nature. In natural environment. And those comments and responses under that tweet are the good opportunity to elaborate a little bit more on this subject. So first of all, let's talk about the phrase, "they just are." And that was the first place where some of the people were like, oh, what the heck, right? So usually we say that animals are not good or bad, they just are, because they don't have moral agency, right? There are moral patients as opposed to humans who have moral agency. So in other words, they can decide what's good or bad. While animals, when the lion or wolf hunts its prey, they are not bad or good or evil. They just are. They don't make moral choices around whether they're going to kill an animal or not, and whether that kill going to be quick and humane, or whether it's going to be, slow and prolonged. And like, for example, bear, it will, basically as soon as the prey cannot escape, it starts eating if it is still alive. So statement, "they just are," means that animals don't have moral agency. And that's why people were like, oh, well, you're talking about hunters now, like hunters are humans. So according to that, they have moral agency. And I have a problem with that statement for two reasons. First of all, we know enough about the world. We know enough about the universe and everything that lives, that everything is on the spectrum. everything is gradually going from one state to another state, and nothing is just like a clear cut, black and white, here's the boundary, and right? So why would we think that in terms of moral agency, it is anything different? So that is a big thing for me. Everything is on a spectrum. And obviously you can have this conversation like, oh, so do you think that some animals are making moral choices? I don't know. Maybe. It is very hard question. It is very hard problem to solve and to answer because we don't know what animals feel and we don't know what animals see. So it is hard. I don't know the answer. I'm not suggesting that, the wolf can be evil. We feel like this is something like a human domain. But at the same time, I don't think that moral agency or being moral agent, moral patient is anything different than anything else in the world, anything else in the biosphere. And there's no reason to not think that this is on a spectrum, right? So this is kind of like an animal part of that saying address. Now I want to address the human part of that. And it really boils down to the question, do humans have free will? That's probably subject for another podcast, not really podcast episode, but another podcast altogether, some philosophical podcast. And there's a lot of those out there already. It's enough that I say that I don't think that humans have a free will. Now, some of you might feel very uncomfortable, and some of them might really say like, oh, Tommy, what are you saying? Well, let me just say that the reason I'm saying that is really grounded in physics and logic, okay? Physics and logic. These are two things that are, to me, are like guiding, like a rails on which I like to set my worldview. So I'm not going to be going any deeper into that. Let's just, for the purpose of this episode, say that whether humans have or don't have free will is a subject for discussion. Okay, so if they don't have a free will, then the question of moral agency is also, the question is in question, right? The idea of moral agency is in question. So that is the first part that lays out a foundation to discussing that statement that hunters are not good or bad, they just are, and should be managed as a part of the wildlife that they hunt. And the responses to that were like, okay, if that's your take, then Homo sapien just are. And I might say like, well, you just might be right, except my tweet and my statement was related specifically to hunters. I am interested in hunters, and that's what I was addressing, and this is what I am addressing in this episode. So yes, we can extrapolate that and say like, if hunters just are, then humans just are. One thing that I want to say now, and that is going to be probably repeated throughout this episode, that I am not really dealing with individuals. Sure, some hunters are good, some hunters are bad, some making bad decisions, some making good decisions. I'm trying to like zoom out and see and look at hunters in general, everything that hunters are. And that brings me to another discussion point, very important to these considerations, meaning who are hunters? And that was one of the responses as well, like who are hunters? So let's try to answer that question. And this is very interesting because I was even thinking about making a short video on this subject, and not specifically on the hunters. It's more of in general, like I'm a podcast host. I'm talking about those things all the time, and I'm increasingly don't know how to talk about those things. Who are hunters? Who are farmers? Who are ecologists? Like farmers, like are the farmers nature destroying, water polluting, bad guys? Are the farmers people being caught between the massive input producers and farming organizations who are in a pocket of input producers, and they just being caught in this situation and trying to make the ends meet? Or are there good people who are leaving place for nature, who are, restoring stuff when they can, when they have, hedges with the birds that are nesting in there and so on and so forth? So saying like farmers is very hard. Like, what do you mean? And the same goes for hunters. Yeah, what do you mean? And the same goes for ecologists. Like, are there, animal rights, shouting, anti-human sentiment people who wants to get back everything into Pleistocene baseline? Or maybe they're hunters and anglers and farmers, and they have a pragmatic approach, and they're trying to understand how the ecosystem, like, who are those ecologists, right? And the same goes for hunters. Who are hunters? One of the responses were like, okay, so let's say the line of guns standing with the shotguns, and the pheasants or grouse is being driven onto them. Are they hunters, right? And obviously my answer is like, well, probably not. They can be, but they're probably not. Despite, they would call themselves shooters or like guns, right? Obviously they are not hunters. I think of hunters as the start of this podcast and the start of that tweet suggests, as a part of nature, part of the ecosystem. Humans as hunters, part of that. And if you're a target shooter and you choose to use wildlife as your target rather than steel or paper, okay, let's not pass judgment right now, because the answer is, again, it depends. Although personally I don't like the idea, but that's not the subject of the podcast. We talk about hunters. So before we proceed, where does it leave us? I think that we need to default into, you know what I mean? And here's another thing, and it is very important. My attention was drawn to this by Tony Bynum. He's a great photographer and cinematographer. And he said to me something along the lines, always establish the baseline, always establish the terminology to understand what we're talking about. And this is very important with all the conversation. And again, this is what I see very often, that sometimes people argue about something while their definitions are different. So we talk about hunting, for example, and our definitions of who the hunter is are slightly different. And then we arguing, and that argument doesn't make any sense because we don't have like a common baseline, common foundation for that conversation. Moreover, establishing that common understanding what we're talking about is often purposely used to manipulate conversation, where people often they sneakily change the definition while they're arguing just to win the argument. And any one of you who spend enough time, commenting and responding and having conversations on social media or otherwise know that sometimes, more often than not, the discussion goes down to basically arguing about semantics, basically arguing what we mean by something, and then that derails the whole argument, right? Because we're always going to be arguing, what do you mean by hunters? What do you mean by farmers? And then it's basically like stonewalling the actual argument and discussion about the actual problem because it's got somewhere in there. Okay, so in this podcast, I know that you, my listeners, are intelligent people, and you are here to hear other opinion, hear my opinion, and perhaps take away something from that. So I expecting that you know the nuance, and that my explanation what I mean by hunters for the purpose of this episode is sufficient, or at least for the purpose of this argument, you know what I mean, kind of deal. So we just have to roll with that using the definition I provided earlier. Another big one that showed up in the responses is talking about poachers. and how you distinguish hunters and poachers. And you might think that this is very easy, but it is not easy. Some would say that, okay, who is a poacher? Poacher is an unethical person who kills wildlife illegally, right? And often poachers and hunters are purposefully kind of conflated. You sometimes see the article that says like illegal hunters or illegal hunting. Well, illegal hunting is poaching by definition. However, it is never that simple. For example, in South America, there are a lot of tribes who are traditionally hunting animals for subsistence or otherwise. And then government decides that now hunting a specific species is illegal because the species is endangered, threatened, or something along these lines. Except that nobody bothered inform those people. Nobody bothered even send someone to their village deep into the forest to tell them that now they can't hunt these animals. Just inform them. Never mind to get their opinion or get them on board or get them to try to understand. So they wake up in the morning and they do what they always do. Except now they're poachers. Therefore, they're making immoral decisions. Like they're not making any decisions. And whether they are poachers or not, it depends on which angle you're going to look at it. And even in England, I think, or in Great Britain, term poacher were like, Robin Hood, or people who were exercising their rights to game animals, to wildlife that were taken away from them by, kings and dukes and, all these goofy titles. Again, we have who is the poacher? Are you a bad guy and a poacher because you're doing something against the law? Mind you that sometimes doing something against the law is actually morally correct action, provided that the law is immoral or malicious, right? So this is like, and I know this is kind of like a wishy-washy, this is everything like, it depends kind of answer. But to explain what I meant by my original statement, we need to go into those things. We need to understand those things, that they are not black and white. So once again, for the purpose of this episode, to me, what means the most is a ecological status of an animal. This is where I would hang my opinion on, whether the ecological status is favorable, unfavorable, whether hunting is causing the damage to the species or not per se law, that law says this or law says that. That's a different conversation altogether. And by the way, I'm not saying to break the law, or I'm not saying it is okay to break the law in certain cases. Maybe it is. It depends, right? That's a reoccurring theme. I'm just saying that when you bring poachers to that picture and you start to discuss my original statement in terms of poachers, and, first, poachers are not hunters, and two, what do you mean by poachers? Because taking some angles, poachers are not poachers. Also, it all depends. Now, another response was talking about the principle of fair chase. And fair chase is a good one. It's another one of those. It depends. We understand the concept of fair chase to give the quarry a fair chance of avoiding being hunted or avoiding being killed. But again, if you think about it in many contexts, it just doesn't make sense. So first of all, fair chase might increase the possibility that the animal will be wounded or mortally wounded. So it is not particularly good morally or ethically. Also, you really want to kill an animal as quickly as possible. And you want to make chances of you succeeding as a hunter as big as possible, right? To some extent, you want this disadvantage against your quarry to be as big as possible. Is it against a fair chase? It's a good question. So fair chase is one of these concepts that is often bring up, especially in a context if certain hunting practices or certain hunts are ethical or non-ethical or moral or immoral. But again, depending on the case, I would argue that fair chase would be to do what you want to do as quickly as possible and with the biggest amount of certainty that it is going to happen. So once again, I don't think that bringing a fair chase into the context of whether hunters are moral agents or moral patients is particularly helpful. They will do a whole host of different behaviors, culturally based on their, technical capabilities. Again, people living in a forest, in a jungle, have different bow than, a rich American hunter who has, bow that is using space technology. It all depends. So once again, I don't think that talking about fair chase is any helpful in considering what I said in the beginning of the podcast, what I said in the beginning in my statement that we're discussing here, that hunters just are, and they basically are part of the wildlife. So let's go back to the original statement that hunters just are, just like the rest of the wildlife. And one other thing that I would like to share with you is that I am convinced we, once again, giving not enough credit to animals for what they do and what they can do and what they're capable of, mainly in the mental aspect of their being. And again, this is a very hard question to answer because we don't know. We know the animals use very complex languages. We know they display a lot of behaviors who were thought to be like human-like, but they're just on the spectrum. They just a little more. But equally, I think we're giving ourselves as humans too much credit. This moral agent, moral patient thing, this is another case of us giving too much credit to human beings. I like this. Oh, we can stop climate change. We can reverse biodiversity loss. Well, apparently not when you look at it. And maybe the individuals can wrap their head around those things. But as a species, as a humanity, as a Homo sapiens, it seems like we don't really can. And I understand that might sound a little bit Vaudian, but I think the model in which humanity are like bacteria in a petri dish, except the petri dish is a planet, might be not that far from the truth. So like that again makes me question whether humans are really moral agents. Do we really have a free will in a sense that can change the overall trajectory of us as a species? And if the answer is no, then when we narrow that down to hunters, well, the answer has to be also no. Let's summarize and let me tell you whether I think I was right about saying what I said or whether my mind was changed as the result of your responses and also as a result of trying to put my thoughts together for this episode of the podcast. I think overall, I was right. Consider this thing that everything that we said about hunting is that hunters are part of the wildlife. Like human hunters are part of the ecosystem for 300,000 years at the very least. And hunting is the core of humanity. This is who we are. I truly believe that. Those instincts might be dormant in some of people, but in general, if we look at the entire of humanity, that's what it is. You heard that said many times, not hunting is a new thing for humans. This is we were hunting through the most of our existence of the planet. And so I would argue that as long as there is wildlife, there will be hunting in one form or another. And you might take an angle and say like, oh, this is poaching, or maybe, oh, this is immoral, but the hunting will be part of the wildlife, will be part of our life as long as the wildlife is around. Now, what does it mean? That brings me to the second part of my tweet, which says, and therefore, hunters should be managed just like we manage wildlife. In a practical sense, that means that every time we have regulations related to wildlife and related to protection of wildlife, we should always take into account hunting. And if you don't do that, you will introduce into this system, into this management system, a lot of unnecessary tension. You can see like even the people who are talking about reintroduction of species, right? The first question is like, oh, we're going to reintroduce wolves into Ireland or Great Britain, right? The first question is like, okay, how can we hunt them? How can we control them? And then people who want to reintroduce it like, oh, no, let's not talk about that. I even was talking with one rewilder, let's use that umbrella term once again. What do you mean by rewilder, right? Who said like, yeah, I'd rather not have wolves in Ireland than allow any hunting. And I think it's like, why, how not wise approach that is. And on the other hand, you see like every successful conservation project has some management and some control of hunting built into that. But control means also allowance. You can go and listen to episode 168, where I was talking with Helen Aruso from Estonia. Very successful wolf conservation project that has hunting controls and hunting allowances built into it. They're doing it right. This is like a gold standard of population control and management. So that's what I meant. Like, hunting is part of wildlife. It's a part of the biosphere. Human hunters are part of the biosphere. They need to be treated as such, and they need to be managed as such. Obviously, some other comments that I received was like, oh, you want to, government wackos to do this and that. And I think that was, I was being accused of being anti-hunter and to some extent by these comments or by these commenters, which couldn't be further from the truth, right? I said many times that I'm as pro-hunting as they get. But I am also pro-wildlife. I am also pro-healthy ecosystems. And I am pro-hunters being part of those ecosystems. That's why I'm saying that they need to be managed as a part of that ecosystem. And one last thing that I need to address here is the concept of managing wildlife and managing the ecosphere. To some extent, you might think is a bloody human arrogance. And I would refer you again to one of the previous episodes, 158, when I was interviewing the author, Simon Musto, the author of the book Wildlife in the Balance, when he said something that I initially disagreed with, but the more I think about it, the more I think that he was right. That the whole idea that we can manage wildlife and we can manage the biosphere is just ridiculous, because the processes that are there are so ridiculously powerful, and we are part of that. Is that, it's like ant was trying to manage the forest. Well, ant can't manage the forest. Ant is a part of the forest. Similarly, we are part of the ecosphere and the biosphere, and hunting is part of what we do. And therefore, coming back again to my argument, as long as there is wildlife, there is going to be hunting in some shape or form. Which also implies that once we, hopefully that's not going to happen, but if we get rid of wildlife and all the animals, then the hunters will be gone as well. But then you may argue, we as a species will be gone as well. That's the future. We don't know how it's going to play out, but everything points into that direction. So to summarize, if we zoom out and look at the entire world, the entire biosphere, perhaps that is what my original tweet was missing. If we zoom out and look at everything that's going on, hunters are just inseparable part of wildlife. They're a part of wildlife. They got to be managed. And whatever you're going to do, you try to ban it, you try to do whatever, that will be there always. You can then say like, okay, it's going to be poaching. But as long as it's going to be humans and humans will be interacting with wildlife, there is going to be human hunting. And so if you look at protecting wildlife, you need to protect hunting. I'm making air quotes for those of you who are just listening to that, not looking. But by protect together with the wildlife, what I mean by that, this is one whole. It cannot be separate. I leave you with that. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that it sparked some thoughts that you might not have if you haven't listened to it. And I invite you to the next episode of the podcast, as usual, in 2 weeks' time. And this time, it's going to be about farming. So don't forget to tune in, and don't forget to subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice or YouTube, so you're not going to miss that one. And let me know what you think. And as always, thanks for listening. Leave the comment, leave the feedback. I'm really curious of your thoughts.